He was an emperor whose breath could empty a room faster than any order he might give, and this was not because of the power he wielded but because of what was happening inside his mouth. Henry VII of Luxembourg ruled the Holy Roman Empire when something began to rot deep in his gums, and the smell that came from him became so overwhelming that courtiers would vomit in his presence while trying to maintain composure at an imperial court. Henry came from the House of Luxembourg, a family of minor nobility elected to lead the Holy Roman Empire in 1308 by German princes who thought they were choosing someone manageable. They wanted a figurehead, someone who would accept that the title had become mostly ceremonial and would not challenge their independence. But this Count from Luxembourg turned out to be far more ambitious than anyone expected. He genuinely believed he could restore real meaning to an office that had become little more than empty words repeated at coronations. The empire was supposed to include both Germany and Italy, though in reality the Italian cities operated as independent entities that paid no attention to whoever claimed authority from across the Alps. Henry looked at this situation and convinced himself that he could succeed where generations before him had failed. In 1310 he crossed into Italy with genuine idealism about restoring peace to cities that had been tearing themselves apart for decades. The Italian city-states welcomed him at first because they were exhausted by endless cycles of revenge, and the idea of outside authority who might enforce order seemed appealing after so many years of chaos. He was crowned King of Italy in Milan with ancient ceremony meant to connect him back to Charlemagne, and for several months it looked like his vision might actually work. But the moment he tried to exercise real authority instead of symbolic gestures, resistance began from all sides. What had started as a peace mission collapsed into the same brutal warfare he had supposedly come to end. By 1311 he was fighting battles and laying siege to rebellious cities while trying to hold together a political project falling apart faster than he could patch it together. Somewhere during these months of violence and disappointment, Henry developed a problem with his mouth that would become far more devastating than any military defeat. It started as something minor, the kind of discomfort anyone might experience and expect to heal naturally. Perhaps a tooth cracked while eating, or his gums became irritated from dust and poor diet that came with constant campaigning. Whatever the initial cause, it refused to follow the normal pattern of healing. His gums became inflamed and started bleeding when he ate or spoke, and court physicians found swelling their usual remedies could not reduce. Within weeks the inflammation had spread instead of receding, and abscesses began forming along his jawline where infection had burrowed deep into tissue beyond where any treatment could reach. The swelling distorted his face in ways visible to anyone, and the abscesses leaked pus through openings in his skin that physicians tried desperately to drain. But nothing made any real difference because bacteria were spreading into bone itself, creating pockets of decay completely beyond the reach of medieval medicine. Then came the smell. And that was when his condition transformed from private medical problem into public nightmare that would define the final years of his reign. At first only his immediate servants noticed it, those who dressed him each morning and stood close enough to speak privately. They detected an unpleasant odor when he opened his mouth, something stronger than ordinary bad breath but not yet overwhelming. Within days it intensified dramatically. Within weeks it became something absolutely no one could ignore. The stench that emerged when he spoke was so powerful it filled entire rooms, so penetrating that perfumes and incense could not mask it, so fundamentally repulsive that even people accustomed to medieval filth found themselves physically overwhelmed. The comparison people kept making was to incense, but inverted into something obscene. The smell was stronger than the most pungent incense burned in Europe's greatest cathedrals, more powerful than any spice or perfume used to cover ordinary human odors. But where incense elevated and purified, this carried the unmistakable character of flesh rotting and decomposing. It was the smell of tissue dying, of meat going bad, of something fundamentally wrong happening inside a living body. And it grew worse every single day. What caused this horror was becoming increasingly visible as infection progressed beyond anything court physicians had encountered. His gums were dying in the most literal sense, soft tissue turning black and necrotic as blood supply failed and bacteria consumed what remained. The flesh pulled away from teeth in strips, exposing bone underneath and creating gaps where food and infected material collected. teeth that had been sound began loosening as bone anchoring them deteriorated. Some fell out completely, leaving bloody sockets that immediately became new sources of putrefaction. Others hung loose by threads of dying tissue, moving when he tried to eat or speak and causing excruciating pain with every movement. The roof of his mouth developed open sores showing no signs of healing. These were not clean wounds that might scab over. They were areas where tissue itself was actively decomposing, breaking down into something no longer resembling human anatomy. Bacteria had spread so deep they were affecting the palate, the hard tissue separating mouth from nasal cavity. As that tissue died and sloughed away, an actual hole began forming between the two spaces. Anything he attempted to eat or drink might come out through his nose instead of going down his throat, and infection now had a direct pathway to spread deeper into his skull. Court physicians tried everything medieval knowledge could suggest. They applied herbal poultices, drained abscesses repeatedly as they refilled with pus, prescribed special diets and prayers and bloodletting. None of it accomplished anything. In desperation they used more aggressive approaches, applying vinegar directly to rotting tissue because acid was one of the few agents they believed might burn away diseased flesh and allow healthy tissue to regenerate. The treatment was extraordinarily painful and completely counterproductive. Vinegar simply ate through what little healthy tissue remained, creating new wounds that had no chance of healing in an environment saturated with bacteria. Flesh inside his mouth was not merely infected the way a sword wound might become infected. It was actively decomposing while he lived, breaking down day by day into something resembling a weeks-old corpse more than living human tissue. The stench continued intensifying beyond anything that could be described as merely unpleasant or strong. It had become a physical presence that assaulted anyone who came near with almost tangible force. It emanated constantly, not just when he opened his mouth but seemingly seeping from his entire being. The smell clung to his clothing in ways no washing could remove, lingered in rooms for hours after he left, and became the defining characteristic that overshadowed everything else including his title and authority. Henry still had to function as ruler because abandoning duties would mean admitting he was no longer capable of governing, and that admission would destroy whatever remained of his political power. He needed to hold audiences, meet with advisors, make decisions requiring face-to-face consultation. But his physical presence had become so unbearable that normal court protocol became almost impossible. Courtiers approaching for audience would notice the smell when still dozens of feet from the throne. As they moved closer following ceremonial requirements, the stench intensified until many turned visibly pale and started breathing through their mouths in desperate attempts to avoid inhaling it. By the time they reached proper distance to address him, they were fighting their body's overwhelming urge to vomit. And many lost that fight. There are accounts of courtiers and ambassadors actually vomiting in the throne room while trying to maintain diplomatic protocol. Some turned away and vomited discreetly to the side, others simply lost control where they stood, and all had to continue afterward as if nothing had happened because medieval etiquette provided no framework for acknowledging what had just occurred. The psychological strain was immense. Courtiers began dreading being summoned to meet with Henry, not from fear of his displeasure but from fear of how their own bodies would respond to his presence. Henry understood exactly what was happening and what effect he had on those around him. He could see them turn pale and struggle for control as they approached. He could observe how they positioned themselves as far away as protocol allowed and turned their faces to avoid breathing toward him. He knew his condition was destroying the dignity of his office in ways no military defeat could accomplish, reducing imperial authority to a grotesque spectacle where important nobles vomited from the smell. But what options did he have? Retiring from public view would require admitting he was no longer physically capable of fulfilling his role, and that would end whatever authority he still maintained. So he continued holding court, continued meeting advisors, continued trying to function while his decomposing mouth made everyone sick. The court made practical adjustments to manage the situation in whatever limited ways were possible. Audiences became dramatically shorter, not because there was less business but because no one could endure the smell for extended periods without becoming violently ill. Meetings were held in the largest rooms with all windows and doors open for air circulation, though this helped only marginally because the stench was too powerful to be dissipated. Some courtiers began wearing cloth soaked in perfume over their noses when near him, a precaution everyone understood but no one acknowledged openly because doing so would mean admitting too explicitly what they were trying to pretend was not happening. Then people began noticing another disturbing pattern. Servants and courtiers who spent significant time close to Henry were falling ill with respiratory infections at rates that could not be explained by chance. A servant who dressed him in the morning might develop fever and coughing by evening. An advisor who met with him in a closed room would emerge with burning throat that progressed within days into full illness with fever, difficulty breathing, and cough that sometimes produced blood. The pattern was undeniable. His rotting mouth was not just producing unbearable stench but actively spreading infection to everyone who breathed the same air. Medieval physicians had no framework to understand this. They theorized about corrupted humors and bad air, which was not entirely wrong metaphorically, but they had no concept of bacteria or disease transmission. What was really happening was that massive bacterial infection consuming tissue inside his mouth was being expelled into surrounding air with every breath he took and every word he spoke. People standing close were breathing in bacteria-laden air, and in some cases those bacteria took root in their respiratory systems, causing illness ranging from mild to life-threatening depending on the strain and individual constitution. Some of these secondary infections proved fatal. Servants and courtiers who had been healthy before extended exposure died from respiratory complications that physicians attributed to various causes but which were almost certainly connected to contagion spreading from his diseased mouth. The imperial court had become a place of genuine medical danger where proximity to the sovereign carried risk not just of social embarrassment but of actual life-threatening illness. And yet the machinery of government had to continue functioning, which meant people had to keep exposing themselves because there was no way to run an empire at arm's length. His physical deterioration accelerated as bacteria spread deeper. Most teeth had fallen out, leaving his mouth a cavity of exposed bone and rotting tissue. The hole in his palate had grown larger as more tissue decomposed, creating a direct opening between mouth and nasal cavity that made eating and drinking nearly impossible. Anything he tried to swallow might come out through his nose, and the sensation of food passing through decomposing tissue was so painful he could barely force himself to consume even thin broths. His face became skeletal as malnutrition ravaged him, skin pulling tight over bones that seemed more prominent daily, features distorted by massive swelling where largest abscesses continued growing and rupturing and refilling in endless cycles. His voice changed completely as the structure of his mouth deteriorated. The sound that came when he tried to speak was rasping and wet, distorted by decomposing tissue and the hole in his palate that affected how air moved. People who had known him before sometimes had trouble recognizing this horrible sound as coming from the same man who had once spoken with confidence about restoring imperial dignity. But they listened anyway when he gave orders because he was still their ruler and the office commanded obedience even when reduced to something monstrous. The military campaign that had brought him south had effectively ended, not through defeat but through the simple reality that he was too physically destroyed to command an army. Soldiers who had to attend him emerged pale and shaken, and morale collapsed not from battlefield losses but from knowledge that their commander was decomposing from inside while trying to lead them. The psychological impact went beyond anything military discipline could overcome. It was one thing to follow a leader into danger, quite another to watch his body rot in front of you while he insisted on continuing a campaign everyone knew was hopeless. Henry refused to accept reality or make the reasonable choice of returning to Germany to die in relative comfort. The stubbornness that had driven him to believe he could succeed where other emperors failed now kept him moving forward even as his body literally fell apart. He was convinced that reaching Rome and receiving proper coronation might somehow salvage his legacy, might transform his failed campaign into something history would remember as achievement rather than disaster. This was delusion, but it was the delusion that kept him going when any rational assessment would have said to stop. In August 1313, nearly 2 years after infection began, Henry pushed south despite being so physically destroyed he could barely sit a horse. His army moved slowly because their commander had to stop frequently to rest, and they left behind a trail of sick men who had spent too much time near his rotting mouth and were now paying the price with their own respiratory illnesses. The smell that had become his defining characteristic followed the army like a banner, announcing his presence long before he could be seen. People said you could tell which direction he had traveled by following complaints about the overwhelming stench that had passed through their towns. On August 24, 1313, while sheltering in the small town of Bunconvento near Siena, his body finally gave up the fight it had been losing for 2 years. The immediate cause might have been fever or organ failure or bacteria spreading into his bloodstream, but the underlying cause was obvious to everyone who had watched him decompose. The infection that had been eating his face had finally finished what it started. Henry died not in battle, not through assassination or political intrigue, but from the simple fact that medieval medicine had no way to combat bacterial infection of this severity. He was killed by his own body's failure to heal a wound that started small and progressed into something catastrophic. The relief that spread through the court when news arrived was something no one could acknowledge openly but everyone felt privately. They mourned the office and what he had been before disease destroyed him, but they were grateful the ordeal was finally over. The smell that had defined the last 2 years would fade. The pattern of respiratory infections would end. The grotesque necessity of maintaining protocol while struggling not to vomit would become memory rather than daily reality. They buried him in Pisa rather than transporting his body back to Luxembourg, and this decision was as much practical as symbolic. The men who handled his remains reported that decomposition which had begun while he lived continued after he died, and the smell that had tormented his court followed his corpse. There was mercy in letting Italy keep the ruler who had come to restore its glory and instead rotted from inside while trying. Henry VII of Luxembourg had wanted to be remembered as the one who restored dignity to his office and brought peace through justice. Instead he became the ruler whose breath could empty rooms, whose presence made people vomit, whose mouth rotted so thoroughly the smell was stronger than incense and whose infection spread to anyone who stood too close. He was killed not by enemies or betrayal but by bacteria eating his face, slowly and publicly, while he tried to govern an empire that had no cure for what was consuming him from within.